Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In this build video, we'll be covering the 1/72nd scale Hobby Boss TBM-3 Avenger. So join me as I assemble this detailed and sometimes fiddly kit, paint it up in a three-tone scheme from the USS Bunker Hill, and give this aircraft a bit of weathering. So without further ado, let's get into making this one. As usual, I began by giving all of the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oils and dirt from them that might prevent paint or glue from adhering to them. Once the sprues were dry, I then started cutting out each part I needed with my side cutters, and then I used my knife to carefully slice away any burrs from where the parts had been attached to the sprue, along with sanding to remove seam lines as well. This kit has a lot of interior parts, which I assembled as sub-assemblies to make painting easier rather than just blindly following the instructions. The cockpit floor had some oxygen bottles, control columns, and what appears to be some sort of hand pump, along with various other controls added, while the main instrument panel was cut out with a tiny bit of sprue still attached to it so I could use it as a handle when painting. The bulkhead for the pilot's compartment was assembled, followed by the framework for the pilot's seat, and the equipment bay behind the pilot. The engine halves were very nicely detailed, but placed quite awkwardly inside of the sprue, requiring a knife to get in and cut them free and a lot of sanding to remove the remaining bits of sprue. The two rows of cylinders were then glued together, and the front gearbox cover, which has some wiring moulded to it, was attached to the front. The bomb bay floor was cut out and the rear bulkhead was attached to it, which also has some of the radar and radio equipment for the rear interior moulded to it. There are several brackets which have to be glued to the bomb bay, though I noticed several sink marks after adding the first set, so I decided to attach the remaining brackets once that had been addressed later on. The rear turret assembly was by far the most delicate and fiddly, consisting of various pieces of framework, a seat, some controls, a clear part for the gun sight which I'd address later, the machine gun, and some ammunition storage, which then sits inside of a cradle, though I did not fully assemble it just yet so that I could paint it a bit more easily. In the rear of the fuselage is the tailwheel bay, which has several bulkheads, some sort of shock absorber or other cylinders, the tailwheel itself, and the rear machine gun, which attaches to the base of the front bulkhead facing towards the rear. The fuselage halves were then cut out, and due to the angle the sprues attached to them, a fair bit of cleanup was required. Some Vallejo water-based putty was used to fill in the sink marks inside of the bomb bay, and once it had dried, this was sanded with a fine file and some sandpaper. The tail hook was glued to one of the fuselage halves, and unfortunately it doesn't seem like this kit has the option to have it extended. Once it was in place, the remaining brackets were then attached to the bomb bay. The kit includes parts for when the bomb bay doors are open or shut, so I decided to try and assemble the open bomb bay doors, which consist of two doors, two bulkheads with actuators, and some photo etch parts for the inner surface of the bomb bay doors. Strangely though, the closed bomb bay part actually has the inner surface details already moulded to it, even though they would never be visible. The four photo etch parts were glued to the doors first with some deluxe material rocket odorless CA glue, and then I tried gluing them to the actuators, but this took a fair bit of time and patience as I had to hold the parts together while they dried, and the contact points were rather small. The kit also includes some optional bombs, a torpedo, or some fuel tanks which can be fitted inside of the bomb bay. I decided to assemble all of them and glue the pylons to each weapon, but not glue those into the bomb bay so that I could make it easier to paint them, as well as allow me to swap out the Avenger's payload. The torpedo features the option to use some photo etch or plastic for the propeller, and all of the bombs and fuel tanks went together well and have very nice details. Part of the wing spar comes moulded to the bomb bay floor, but a smaller section comes separate, so I decided to glue it to one of the fuselage halves, making sure it lined up as it dried. The cowling and engine bulkheads were then cut out, and I decided to glue the engine to the bulkhead for painting, though unfortunately I glued it to the wrong end, but I would later correct this. The wings can be glued in a folded position, but I decided to have them extended, so I simply cut out the lower and upper halves for each side, glued them together, and clamped them with some bulldog clips while the glue bonded. They have fantastic surface details, and the parts fitted quite well together. Looking at reference photos, most Avengers seem to have had the inside of their wheel wells sprayed in the same colour as the underside of the wings, so once the wheels had been glued to their struts, I went ahead and glued them inside of the wheel wells of each wing, since I wouldn't need to bother masking them off while painting. The rest of the landing gear struts and landing gear bay doors were then glued to the main strut once it was lined up. Finally, I moved on to priming all of the interior and engine sub-assemblies to then prepare them for painting. This was done with Vallejo Gloss Black Primer mixed to an even ratio with some Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver. On each assembly, I gradually built up several layers of the primer, keeping each pass reasonably thin until the surface just became wet, and I continued to do this until everything was a solid glossy black colour. I then gave the primer at least 12 hours to fully cure, before I would then start applying the paint. The engine was sprayed with some Vallejo Model Air aluminium, again gradually building the colour up in several passes, and with the paint thinned to a ratio of 1 part paint to 1 part Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver. After looking at photos of Avengers, both restored and during wartime, I decided to try a mix of Vallejo Model Air 71010 interior green with 71289 US dark green to get a darker yellowish green. The paints were mixed evenly and once again thinned down with some flow improver, and then applied on pretty much evenly on every inside surface. Since the black primer was quite dark, it took a few layers to apply an evenish coat of this colour, but I appreciate the subtle shadow effect applying the paint over the black creates. I was very happy with the green I'd mixed up, as I thought it matched a lot of the reference photos I had on hand, although I suspect there was a fair bit of variety given how long the Avenger was being produced, and the fact that both Grumman and General Motors were both building them in different factories. I also used this green on the inside of the engine cowling, since this kit represents a General Motors produced aircraft, and some of the sources I read suggested they did this or left them in a zinc chromat coat, while Grumman built aircraft often had a grey interior colour used. With the base colours down, I could now work on picking out the many details, starting with dry brushing some Vallejo Model Colour Green Sky to add highlights to all the raised ribbing details inside of the bomb bay, along the fuselage walls, and all of the various details on bulkheads. AK Interactive Acrylic Dunkelgrau was then used to paint the instrument panel, machine guns, various bits of radio equipment, some of the wiring inside of the bomb bay, and various controls around the cockpit. In reality, these parts would have mostly been black, but I found using a dark grey for black instead can help make them look more detailed, and allow black to be used later on for dials on the main instrument panel to give them contrast. In some reference photos I found of various Avengers, the wiring inside of the bomb bay and cockpit could sometimes be what appeared to be bright silver with some anodized blue attachments. I'm not sure if these are just on restored aircraft, but they were a unique feature, so I decided to try and replicate them on mine. I first carefully picked out the wires with Vallejo Model Air Chrome, making sure I only had a small amount of dry paint on the brush by wiping most of the excess off, and then basically dry brushing these wires. This was also done for the wiring and several raised switches inside of the cockpit, and also used as a base colour for the radar screen in the rear part of the aircraft. The rudder pedals come moulded to the main instrument panel and were picked out with some of the same green I'd used for the rest of the interior, while the oxygen bottles were painted with Vallejo Model Colour Deep Green. The machine guns were later repainted with some Vallejo Flat Black, and then the leather headrests for the pilot and the machine gun grips were painted with some Vallejo Model Colour Flat Earth. The recessed dials on the instrument panel were carefully painted with flat black to make them stand out from the instrument panel's main colour, and after looking at various photos, I decided to initially use Vallejo Model Colour Gunship Green for the bench seats, as well as the pilot's armrests and the base of the joystick. Finer details and individual controls and raised buttons were painted using various colours, including more of the Vallejo Model Air Chrome, some Vallejo Model Colour Vermilion Red, Model Air US Dark Green, Model Colour Gold for the machine gun ammo, and other Vallejo model colours including Flat White, Flat Earth, and Bright Orange. After the last of the wiring in the bomb bay was painted chrome, I then got out some Tamiya X23 Clear Blue and used this to carefully dab onto the joints and details on the wiring to replicate the blue anodized parts. Again, I'm not certain if this was done to World War II era aircraft, but I thought it was an interesting effect to try and create. To my knowledge, it would have been possible to do at the time, and at the very least, it's accurate on restored aircraft. I decided to repaint the gunship green covers with Vallejo Model Colour Blue Green to make them a bit lighter, and once this was done, I started to add some weathering in the form of metal chipping. This was done by dry brushing some Vallejo Model Air aluminium at the base of the rudder pedals, on various raised details, the metal edges of the seats and scratch down the backrests, and some parts of the floor where the crew would move around or possibly bump stuff. I decided to weather the headrest and pilot map case with a dry brushing of Vallejo model colour 70929 light brown, and then I picked out the case's straps with Vallejo model colour saddle brown. In some places the chipping was a bit too subtle, so I added a second coat, especially around the rudder pedals, and although oftentimes I apply a black panel wash to add grime and detail, for this build I decided I did not want to make the cockpit any darker, and the highlights were already adding plenty of details, so I skipped this step and went ahead to gluing the bomb bay assembly into place. It fitted well into the fuselage halves, so I then started adding the various bulkheads to the cockpit floor and assembled the rear turret. The turret assembly only has a small set of pins to attach it inside of the cradle piece, which means you can position the rear gun in almost any position, though I tried not gluing it so that I could rotate and elevate the gun. In the end, however, the framework was very fragile, so it may have been better to have just glued it into place. The cockpit floor, tail wheel assembly, base piece for the rear turret, and the instrument panel were glued to the inside of the fuselage, and then after taking a few photos, I sealed it all up, never to be seen again. Well, at least not as clearly. Thankfully, the door for the radio compartment can be left open, so I left this unglued, just like the turret, weapons and bomb bay parts, for modifying how the model is displayed, as well as for stop motion purposes. I then ran a bead of Revell Contactor Professional along the fuselage halves, and then some bulldog clips and tape were used to hold the halves together while they bonded. I also ran some Tamiya extra thin along the seams between the parts to help strengthen the bond and also fill in any small gaps. Once the fuselage had had an hour or so to dry, I then removed the tape and glued the wings to the fuselage. They fitted very well thanks to the wing spars to line them up, and once they're in place, I then cut out the horizontal stabilizers and cleaned them up. Part of the lower surface comes as a separate piece, which I glued to the stabilizers, before then attaching them to the rest of the aircraft. While working on the interior, I'd forgotten to also paint the rear gunner's sight. Part of this is clear, but the controls and framework that's moulded to it would need to be painted, so I mixed up some more of the interior green and US dark green mix and carefully painted these details in several coats. The engine details were also painted at this stage, first with some Vallejo Model Air Ocean Grey for the gearbox cover applied in several coats, and then I used flat black for the cylinder head covers and some of the other engine details. It was while attempting to then add the engine to the fuselage and cowling that I realised I'd glued it to the wrong side of the bulkhead, but fortunately this was not too hard to correct, and soon the engine and its cowling were in place and fitted nicely. There were a small number of gaps present on the model, which I now filled in with some Vallejo water-based putty, most notably around the wings and the fuselage joints. I used a cocktail stick to first apply it, and before it dried I rubbed away the excess with a damp finger. The putty was then given 24 hours to fully cure before I then used some very fine 1500 grit sandpaper to smooth some of it down. Stupidly though, I left the optional open bomb bay assembly in place, even though I could have taken this off the aircraft as I'd not glued it, and while sanding I damaged the actuators and would struggle to repair them due to again the very small attachment area. The right side 50 cal barrel also broke off the wing, which unfortunately comes moulded to it, and though I was initially able to glue it back on, I would later on lose it and have to replace it. The turret sight handle was painted black, and after the clear framework had been neatened up by gently scratching away any of the excess acrylic paint from it with a cocktail stick, I then glued it to the turret assembly. Looking at reference photos, this part often has a green anti-glare coat on it, so I decided to replicate this by painting the clear section of the sight with a few coats of Tamiya clear green. The kit includes masks for all of the clear parts, so I initially planned to cut out and clean up all of the clear parts and then attach them to the model and use the masks while painting. The main canopy required some cleanup and sanding to it and the fuselage to achieve a good fit, though in the end I decided to instead use the kit's part as a template to vacuform a new one so that I could have the canopy for the pilot's area open or closed. The rear turret fitted perfectly to the rotating base, so I decided to mask it up and paint it with the rest of the aircraft, though I wouldn't glue it so that I could still access the rear turret when the model was done. The various small windows were very fragile and tricky to remove the excess sprue from, and I also found that they didn't fit super well into the fuselage, and I cracked one of them while trying to get it into place. Perhaps next time it would be better to fit them in before joining the fuselage halves so that the fuselage sections were more flexible when fitting these parts into place. Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue was used to glue the small clear windows into place since it dries fast and doesn't fog them up. I was then ready to mask up the model for some priming and painting. White tack was used to mask over the engine as well as the main cockpit and inside of the rear turret just in case, while for the turret glass and smaller windows I used the included masking set. Personally, I find I much prefer using acrylic paints to hand paint canopies, especially when they have cleanly moulded and strong raised lines for their framework, but I figured since the kit had pre-cut masks, I might as well give them a try. A bit of tape was used to mask the tailwheel and open bomb bay door assemblies' interior surfaces, while white tack was used to mask the aircraft's bomb bay and hold the closed door part in place while painting. After a quick wipe over with a microfiber cloth to remove any dirt or plastic dust from the model, I then primed the exterior in the same way I'd primed the interior with the Vallejo Gloss Black Primer. And once the whole model's exterior was a uniform glossy black, I then left the model aside for 24 hours to let the primer fully cure before moving on to painting. I typically like to paint camouflage with the lightest colours first, which for this build would be the insignia white undersides. This was done by mixing 5 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 3 drops of Vallejo Model Air light gull grey and 4 drops of Vallejo Model Air insignia white. This mixture was then gradually sprayed onto the aircraft in the middle of the individual panels to act as a pre-shaded base coat. The reason I mixed in some light gull grey was to make the paint a bit darker, so I could later on add more highlights over the top of it with pure insignia white. This mixture was also sprayed on some of the upper surface as well, but in a more patchy and inconsistent manner. I did several passes with this colour until it was reasonably strong, and also blended some of the areas together a little bit more with some general wider coats. The second lightest colour would be the intermediate blue, which was for the fuselage sides and the tail. 5 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver were mixed evenly with 5 drops of Vallejo Model Air intermediate blue, and then I carefully sprayed it at a slightly lower than normal pressure, carefully following the edge of where it met the insignia white, before then gradually filling in the panels along the sides of the aircraft. Some Avengers seem to have had some of the intermediate blue sprayed on the leading edges of their wings, so I also applied a band of it in that position. I couldn't find any photos of 313, which is the scheme included in this kit, so I ended up looking at other TBM-3 Avenger photos, including of other ones from the USS Bunker Hill, to get a rough reference for the positioning of these colours. One particularly tricky feature to paint was the stripe of blue under the wings that cuts off the lower fuselage white around the bomb bay. I did this by carefully running my airbrush along this line in a few coats, and would later do some more neatening up. After a few passes, the intermediate blue was looking pretty solid, so I moved on to the third and final camouflage layer with some Vallejo Model Air USN Flat Sea Blue. Along the fuselage sides, I basically went in a continuous line where it met the intermediate blue to establish where the colour transition would be, and I kept it reasonably close and smooth at a low pressure. For large areas, like the panels on the wings, I gradually filled individual panels first, and then continued to make several light passes until the colour was nicely built up and reasonably uniform. The dark sea blue line on the fuselage was pretty thin, and painting the end was particularly tricky, but fortunately on this scheme the roundel sort of covers where the sea blue ends towards the tail, so I didn't have to be too precise in the end. So far, I found the US Navy 3-tone countershade pretty much justifies me getting an airbrush, and is one of my favourite schemes so far to paint. In my opinion, it doesn't need any masking to do a good job with. There's something very satisfying about the layers gradually building up over the top of each other, and it's so much easier to get a soft and smooth transition between the colours using an airbrush compared to brush painting. With all 3 colours now applied, I moved on to some post-shading and highlights, this time working from top to bottom. Some USN Sea Blue was mixed with approximately 3 parts blue to 3 parts insignia white to make a saturated lighter colour, which I then sprayed onto the fabric control surfaces especially, and then randomly onto panels for some paint fading, artificial highlights, and variation. I did this quite heavily based on my experience trying this technique on my Hasegawa Corsair in a previous build, and finding that later the varnishing and weathering tends to make the effect much more subtle than when it's initially applied. Before doing the highlights with the intermediate blue, I first did a few touch-ups to adjust the camouflage pattern, and then much like with the sea blue, I mixed in some insignia white with the intermediate blue, and highlighted some of the panels with varying degrees. I applied the highlights more heavily on higher surfaces such as the tail and top parts of the cowling and fuselage, which would be more exposed to lighting as well as weathering from the harsh Pacific sun and salty sea air on an aircraft carrier. On the underside of the aircraft, pure insignia white was mostly applied as several light coats over the underside, allowing the pre-shading to do most of the work. By doing the white last, I could also more easily neaten up the insignia white around the wings and the bomb bay areas. I found the landing gear was a bit tricky to airbrush due to some of the awkward angles, and I didn't want to get any overspray on the blue, but I did my best and could easily do some extra work later on with a brush. The camouflage was pretty much done, but I still needed to add the thin yellow band on the front of the cowling, which I believe was a marking only used by USS Bunker Hill aircraft for identification. This was done with some 1mm thick Tamiya masking tape for the edges, and was a bit of a challenge since the cowling has a very curved shape. Thicker tape was then used to mask off the cowling from overspray, and some 3mm masking tape was used to mask off the blue where a set of aircraft's numbers would be. 2 drops of flow improver were mixed with 1 drop of Vallejo model colour pink, and 1 drop of insignia white. I then sprayed this mixture carefully, building the colour up gradually around the nose. Pink is a fantastic base colour for yellow, and I now use it whether I'm brush painting or airbrushing, as it reduces how many layers of yellow paint are required by quite a lot, and makes it easy to achieve a solid yellow colour using less layers of paint and taking less time. After the pink had become solid, I let it dry for about an hour before I then mixed some Vallejo Model Air RLM4 yellow, thinned down with 1 part flow improver to 1 part paint. As you can see, the yellow was almost immediately a solid colour, and it only took a few passes, stopping to refill my airbrush once to make the yellow ring a nice solid yellow. Usually I'd paint bands and fuselage markings like this before doing the camouflage and then mask them off while doing it, so that there's no raised edge to them. But since this was a thin line and some of the intermediate blue interrupted it, I decided it would be much easier to apply the yellow over the top of the blue, which is what I'd imagine would have been done in real life. Once the yellow was done, I carefully removed my masking around it and found that there were a few small bits of overspray. To fix this, I used a brush to carefully apply a thin layer of either insignia white, intermediate blue, or the USNC blue to fix the mistakes. I also used a brush to paint the tailwheel and main landing gear in several thin layers of insignia white. I probably could have tried airbrushing the tailwheel instead of masking it off, but I'd originally assumed it would be interior green on its interior surface, and it was also a lot easier to mask off the entire tailwheel rather than trying to mask off the tailwheel's bay. Vallejo model colour flat black was then painted onto the tyres of the landing gear in several passes. I tried to keep the paint thin by mixing in a fair bit of water so that the layers would not obscure the tyre details, and so that I could use the capillary motion to guide the paint around the raised wheel hubs. Since the paint was thin, the tyres required several coats, so while letting each layer dry, I painted the tips of the propeller blades with a mix of white and pink, much like I'd done with the cowling, to create a base colour for the yellow prop tips. Once the last coat of black had dried on the wheels and the propellers had received their yellow tips, I decided to seal my paint job in so far with some Vallejo gloss varnish. This was applied from a distance over the entire model and gradually built up in several layers, doing my best to apply it so that the surface just became visibly shiny, but not covered in a build-up of liquid varnish. Not only would the varnish help protect the paint job, but it would also provide a smooth, glossy surface for the decals to be applied to, helping to prevent them from silvering. The varnish would be given at least 24 hours to fully cure before I then moved on to decals. To apply the decals, I first cut the sheet into manageable sections and then applied the main roundels and markings first. I heated up some water with a kettle and stuck the decal sheet in them for just under a minute and then placed them onto some paper towel to absorb the excess water. The decals were then slid into place one by one using a brush or my finger, and occasionally I would apply a bit of water onto the model to help move the decals and line them up. Curiously, the Bunker Hill aircraft has 2 different identification numbers, both 313, which is the main number that appears, and 148, which the instructions refer to the aircraft as. My guess is that either the Avenger had spare parts given to it from another aircraft, so it has the numbers from the donor plane, or perhaps more likely it was transferred from another unit and the old numbers that were used for it weren't ever replaced. Once all of the main decals were in position, I then gently dabbed on some Vallejo decal softener, followed by Tamiya decal adhesive to help them soften into the kit's insane amount of recess details. This worked pretty well, and even some of the rivets would show through them, and the decals were all of pretty good quality. This process was then repeated with the many common stencils that are included. There are quite a lot of them, so to make sure I didn't miss any, I used a pencil to cross off the decals as I applied them from the sheet, and eventually the job was done. The only issue I had was that, unfortunately, one of the smaller decals which goes over the fuselage roundel seemed to slightly move as it dried, and so it doesn't quite sit level. After the last decal had about 12 hours to fully set, I then sealed all of the decals in and gave the paint job its final finish with some Vallejo matte varnish. This was done in the exact same manner as the gloss varnish coat had been applied previously, and once done I left the model aside for 24 hours to let the varnish fully cure before moving on to weathering. While the varnish cured, I created a copy of the kit's canopies with my vacuforming machine, which was done by filling up the original kit's canopy with milliputch to give it an internal structure that was somewhat heat resistant. After that it had 24 hours to harden, I would then use my dental vacuform machine and some 1mm thick clear styrene to make some new canopies. I ended up making two since the first one was a little bit dodgy, and although the clarity was pretty much the same as the kit's and the distortion reduced, unfortunately the framework was not as sharp and defined, which would have an impact later on. I cut out the canopy from the vacuform sheet and then cut it into 3 sections so that I could have it open or closed where the pilot's area is, and the new canopy fitted pretty nicely with only some light trimming required. When I removed the masks from the turret, I found that they'd worked pretty well, but since I'd painted the turret while it was on the aircraft, some spots would still need to be touched up, especially at its base. While painting the main canopy's framework, I also touched up the turret and did some extra corrections around the edges of the cockpit on the fuselage, using the same interior green mix from earlier on. While that colour dried, I painted the propeller hub and engine radiators with Vallejo Model Colour Natural Steel, and the tip of the propeller spinner with Vallejo Model Air Aluminium. The external canopy colours were then applied, being either USNC blue or intermediate blue for parts of the turret. Since I'd used acrylic paints for the canopies, after they'd dried I could then use a cocktail stick to remove any excess paint or mistakes, helping to neaten up the canopy's framework. When it came to weathering the aircraft, the first step I did would be the usual metal chipping. I did this by dipping a fine brush in some Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, wiping the excess off with some paper towel, and then stippling the brush very gently into the areas I wanted to add some metal chipping. Most of the photos of Avengers I looked at didn't really have much in terms of metal chipping, so I decided to keep the effect very subtle and light. The areas I chipped included the leading edges of the propeller blades, the front of the engine cowling, along the various access panels maintenance crews would regularly open, around the footholes the crew would have used to get into the aircraft, and along the wing in spots where foot traffic from the pilots and ground crew would be. Next, the engine received a heavy coating of Tamiya black panel accent for some oil and grime, as well as to highlight the engine's details. The panel liner was also then applied along the recessed panel lines along the fuselage to again add some grime and dirt build-up in the recesses and to highlight the kit's surface details. In the past, I'd always removed the panel liner with X20 enamel thinners, but after the strange peeling I encountered when doing my 2 Airfix RAAF Beaufighters, I decided to instead try dipping a brush or cotton swab in AK odorless thinners, and then rub away the excess panel liner, leaving it only in the recesses. I found that the odorless thinners didn't seem to do as good a job as the X20, so they took a bit more time and rubbing to wear away the enamel wash, but it did do the job eventually, and didn't do any damage to the varnish layers underneath. I also found that the cotton bud was a bit more effective than a brush, though they did work pretty well together by using the brush to first apply the odorless thinners, and then rubbing over the area with the cotton bud. The enamel wash also seemed to become a little bit more blended when the odorless thinners were used, rather than straight up removed, so the effect ended up a little bit more subtle and blended, which I was quite happy with. Once the fuselage was done, I then repeated the process of applying the panel liner followed by the odorless thinners along the wings, the landing gear, and on the separate part for the closed bomb bay. Apart from having to repair the right side landing gear, the enamel wash was done without any issues, so I then returned to the main canopy. Since my usual method hadn't worked out so well, I decided to try using the kit's included masks and airbrush the main canopy after I'd scratched off the hand-painted layers. I also found a cocktail stick was very helpful to push down the edges of the masks and also make small adjustments so they lined up correctly. The masks fitted the new part pretty well, though I did find a few spots where the framework was rather narrow, especially towards the rear of the canopy, but it could have been the way that I'd applied them. The masked canopies were then attached to some blue tack to protect their insides from any overspray, and also to give me something to hold onto while painting them. The canopies were then sprayed with their interior colour using a mixture of interior green and US dark green like from before, and after that had dried, which didn't take too long, I then sprayed them with some USN Sea Blue for their external colour. I did consider priming them, but the primer colour would have shown up as the frame's interior colour, so I decided to instead just use the green. Once the external colour was dry, I removed the masks and found they'd done a perfect job, and I had some very nice and sharp canopy frames that were nicely defined despite the softer moulded framework. I don't usually like to mask canopies, so this was one of the first I've actually done, though I am tempted to try it again in future builds, especially if I have pre-cut masks. Now that they were painted, I could glue the forward and rear canopy sections to the fuselage with some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue, since this glue dries strong like super glue but doesn't fog up clear parts. This was then followed by adding the inside framework that the sliding section would go over the top of, which was created with some 1mm styrene glued to the front and rear canopy sections. Some of the styrene was also cut to a triangle and glued to the top of the tail to replace the missing antenna, which must have come off earlier on. The pitot tubes, antennas and other fine parts were painted by brush on the sprues, and once they'd been painted I cut them out and glued them to the model. For some reason the instructions and kit include a pitot tube on both sides of the aircraft's wings, but after double checking my references I believe that the Avenger only ever had one pitot tube and this was located on the left side. There are also some small U-bend things that go on the wingtips, a mast which I glued with the Rocket Odorless CA glue to the separated sliding canopy segment, and two radar antennas under the wings on each side which have a plastic base piece and a bit of photo etch for the actual antennas. The exhausts had been painted with Model Air Chrome as a base colour and then glued behind the engine cowling, but they required a fair bit of sanding before they would fit into place properly. Earlier on, I'd broken the kit's original rear turret and wing 50 cal machine gun barrels, so I had to 3D print some replacements, which I then glued into place. The exhausts then received some touch-ups with Model Air Chrome, the pitot tube and nav lights on the wings with Model Air RLM01 Silver for their shiny parts, and the machine gun barrels with Model Air Gunmetal Metallic. The antennas also received some small touch-ups with the various camouflage colours, before I then moved on to the last weathering step, which would be some oil paint weathering. A drop of Abteilung 502 white, black, engine grime and flat earth oil paint was squeezed out onto some cardboard and then sat aside for 2 hours to let the excess oil bleed out of the paints before use. I then used a selection of brushes to apply the oil paints along with some odorless thinners to both reactivate the slightly dried paints and also to soften or remove the excess oil paint from the model with careful brushing. The first effect I created was some gun stains and soot on the machine guns with some black, followed by some leaks and stains around the landing gear and shell ejection ports on the underside of the wings. For the leaks, I applied the paint with a fine brush and then used a larger one dipped in thinners to streak the paint backwards in the direction air would flow over the wings in flight, creating some streaks. Heavy oil stains were then added around the engine using a mix of black and engine grime, while the exhausts received a base coating of black for the darker stains at their exits. Since I'd done painting and fading on the upper wings before the decals had been applied, they looked a little bit too new compared to the paint job, so I decided to add some fading to them by dabbing on very small amounts of the white, primarily in the middle of the panels around the roundels, and then I used a brush dipped in the thinners to soften the effect and remove it from spots until I was happy with the faded effect on the roundels. Looking at reference photos, the exhausts on most Avengers seemed to be very dark and concentrated to just behind the exhaust, often with some streaking onto the bomb bay doors, and a tiny bit sometimes getting flicked up towards the wings. I also noticed that many photos showed brown stains a bit further back that are quite prominent on the bomb bay doors, so I gradually built up this effect as well, making sure to also apply them to the closed bomb bay option when I have the doors switched on the model. The bomb bay seems to be a particular source for a lot of leaks and stains, so I added some with blackened engine grime along the seam lines where the doors meet, and also streaked backwards towards the tail where photos show these stains can be particularly noticeable. Some photos showed brownish stains at the wing roots, so I applied a thin layer of engine grime and blended it in with some odorless thinners. A darker, more prominent streak of this colour was then added, coming back from the fuel filler ports, and then I dabbed a tiny bit of the engine grime along the wing's folding point for some subtle leaks and stains. To add some fresh oil marks and leaks, I dabbed a very small amount of Tamiya X1 Gloss Black enamel paint around the engine cowling, and then gently removed the excess with the odorless thinners to create some tiny little leaks, which often occur even with well-maintained engines. As the saying goes, if a radial engine isn't leaking oil, there's probably none in it. The oil paints take quite a long time to dry, so I left the model aside for 24 hours, before I then added some bits of sprue to create some basic landing lights to the underside of the wings. These were then painted a coat of RLM01 silver, and while they dried, I painted the nav lights with Tamiya Clear Red on the left light, and Clear Green on the right one. When I tried to put the landing lights from the kit into place, I found that they were too wide, so I decided to just apply a film of micro crystal clear over the lights to act as the clear cover, and with much difficulty I sanded and pushed the nav light and the leading edge wing lights into place, and then glued them with some odorless CA glue. The last detail to add to the aircraft was the rigging for the radios, which I created using some AK Interactive mega thin rigging wire. This was superglued to the tail and then stretched to the canopy mast and glued into place, and then the excess was removed. This process was then repeated with a smaller line which runs from the rear of the canopy up to the main rigging line. I almost forgot to finish the kit's included armament, but after the bombs had been sprayed Model Air USAF olive drab, the front of the torpedo and the fuel tanks with Model Air aluminium, the attachment points had been painted to match the aircraft's interior, the torpedo prop had been painted model colour gold, and all of these parts had been varnished by brush, I could finally call my Hobby Boss TBM-3 Avenger build finally completed. And here you can see the results I achieved with this model. So I'm super happy with how this one turned out, and I think this build is quite a strong contender for the best one I've done so far. I'm especially happy with how the camouflage and weathering turned out, and I feel I've applied a lot of what I learnt when doing Pappy Boyington's Corsair with the Hasegawa kit previously, especially in terms of fading the paint on the upper wings and tying in the decals with the weathering. Though I probably should have spent a bit more time improving the kit's surface finish, perhaps with some more sanding and also filling of one or two gaps or accidental scratches. I reckon I can still improve my Vacuform Canopy further, and of course I'm also welcome to other people's feedback and suggestions on other things I can improve. The kit itself went together alright, with the issues I have mainly being the extra cleanup required due to some of the awkward ways parts were attached to the sprue, some of the turret parts being especially fragile and flimsy, the somewhat poor fit of most of the clear parts, and also the kit's lack of an open cockpit canopy out of the box when you have such a fantastic interior and also no crew figures to display the aircraft in flight. But negative points aside, the kit has fantastic detail both on the inside and the outside, the option for folded wings, a nice selection of rockets, bombs, extra fuel tanks or a torpedo for armament. It seems to be pretty spot on apart from the extra pitot tube, and although double the cost of the older Academy kit, I think it's definitely worth that extra cost if you want a much more detailed kit. It's definitely a fiddling and slightly challenging build, so I wouldn't recommend it unless you have patience and a bit of modelling skill already, but if you do and you want a nice detailed Avenger, it's definitely a fantastic kit I would recommend, and one I'm almost certainly going to build again someday in the future. Thank you very much for watching this build video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you don't miss any future build videos, inbox reviews or stop motions. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying this kit, but also the products I used to make it, and the time I spent making the videos for it. For a while now, I've been releasing my build videos as 3 different parts, usually covering assembly, painting, and then weathering, but I'm going to be trying and doing them all as just 4 videos, so there won't be any 3-part segments. So that way you guys can watch my build videos all as one, and hopefully it'll also make the algorithm a little bit happier, so I can get a little bit more back from YouTube making these videos. That's it for now, but please go check out some of my other videos if you enjoyed this one, and until next time, as always, take care, and model on.